The last thing I saw before the world swam into a murky, silent black was my daughter's reflection in the polished silver of the syringe. She didn't flinch. Her husband, Marcus, simply held my arm in a grip as soft as it was unbreakable and whispered, "It's for the best, Clara. Just relax." They weren't trying to kill me. They were trying to erase me, all because I refused to let them have the one thing my late husband, Arthur, left to protect me: 7 pristine, impossibly rare gold coins. What they didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and in less than an hour, the world they had so carefully constructed would begin to burn to the ground. I moved into their sprawling colonial home in Marblehead, Massachusetts, the week after I turned 68. It wasn't because I was frail or forgetful. My small Boston apartment was paid for, and my part-time work curating historical documents at the university library gave my days a quiet, satisfying rhythm. But Eliza, my daughter, had insisted. She'd spoken of missing our evening talks, of wanting me closer to the ocean air, of how Marcus had even redesigned the East Wing guest suite just for me. At the time, I saw it as a bridge across the distance that had quietly grown between us. I didn't recognize it as a cage. The house sat on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, a fortress of gray shingles and white trim against the moody New England sky. Eliza had decorated my room in shades of sea glass and sand, my favorite colors. A framed photograph of Arthur and me on our wedding day sat on the nightstand, a silent, smiling sentinel. I stood there that first day, suitcase in hand, and allowed a fragile hope to take root. Maybe this would be good. Maybe this would heal us. It wasn't that I had nowhere else to go. My life in Boston was my own. It was a life of quiet corners, the scent of old paper, the meticulous joy of tracing a family's history through faded ink. That work was my anchor. So was the hum of my own refrigerator, the worn armchair where I read, the small collection of porcelain birds on my windowsill. But Eliza spoke of wanting her children to hear my stories, to know their heritage. I believed her. The first week was a carefully staged dream. Eliza made me Earl Grey tea each morning. Marcus, a man whose ambition wore a bespoke suit, would ask about my archival work with a convincing performance of interest. The grandchildren, absorbed in their digital worlds, would occasionally surface to listen as I spoke of their ancestors who had sailed from Ireland. I felt a pang of guilt for ever having doubted her intentions. Then slowly, the tide began to turn. Eliza started mentioning finances. Her tone was airy, but the words were anchors. She'd talk about the brutal cost of the children's private school, the second mortgage they'd taken out for a renovation, the unpredictability of Marcus's investments. Marcus would mention a venture, a portfolio of distressed international assets, high return, he'd say, but requiring significant capital. He said it casually one evening while uncorking a bottle of wine that cost more than my weekly groceries. I nodded, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. A few days later, Eliza came to my room holding her laptop. She sat beside me on the antique chaise lounge, her smile practiced. She said they needed a short-term infusion of liquidity, a temporary loan against my assets to secure a position in Marcus's fund. She promised it would be returned with interest, within a year. It would secure their future, she said, the grandchildren's future. I asked her how she knew the exact value of my portfolio. She didn't miss a beat. "I've always kept an eye on things for you, Mom. You know, just in case." Her eyes were bright, but held no warmth. That night, I lay awake, listening to the house settle around me. The old wood groaned like a ship at sea. I thought of Arthur, how we had saved for decades, living modestly, never touching the principal. I thought about the 7 gold coins he'd given me on our last anniversary. They weren't just investments. They were artifacts, each one a rare double eagle from a shipwreck preserved in time. They were his final gift, a tangible piece of his love and foresight. I realized I had moved into a house where affection was currency and love had a price tag. By the end of that second week, I started sleeping with a chair wedged under my doorknob. Looking back, I wonder if you've ever felt that subtle, chilling shift, the moment a hug feels like an appraisal, when a question about your health is really a probe for weakness. If you have ever entrusted your heart to someone, only to feel the walls of their kindness closing in, then you understand. And if you haven't, then stay with me. Because what came next ripped the beautiful facade clean off, and once you see the rot underneath, there's no pretending anymore. By the start of the third week, the subtlety vanished. It began with my mail. I noticed letters from my bank and brokerage firm were arriving already opened, resealed with a careless strip of tape. When I asked, Eliza blamed the postman, a flimsy excuse that hung in the air between us. Then, she handed me a stack of papers one afternoon, a detailed budget of household expenses. She had highlighted a line item for guest contribution. Her voice was level, almost serene. Fairness keeps families from having resentments, Mom. Marcus, standing behind her, nodded his silent, chilling endorsement. I didn't fight. I took the paper to my room and wrote a check. The amount was insignificant, but the message was a declaration of war. They didn't want a mother. They wanted a boarder with benefits. A few days later, I found Marcus in the study, a room I was implicitly discouraged from entering. He was at the large mahogany desk, scrolling through what looked like my digital bank statement on his tablet. He closed it the second I appeared in the doorway, his smile instant and predatory. Later, when they were out, I checked the hidden compartment in my antique writing desk where I kept my important documents. The leather folio was there, but the clasp was undone. The order of the papers inside was wrong. I trusted my instincts, honed by years of archival work. Someone had been searching. The next morning, Eliza brought up estate planning over breakfast. She spoke of a friend whose mother had a stroke and the legal nightmare that followed. She mentioned joint accounts, the simplicity of a revocable trust, the peace of mind it would bring. "It's not about the money, Mom," she said, pouring me more coffee. "It's about making sure you're cared for, no matter what." Marcus added that he had a lawyer who specialized in seamless asset transitions. He could have the paperwork drawn up by the end of the week. I stared into my cup, the dark liquid reflecting a face I barely recognized. That afternoon, I drove to a small cafe in the next town over and called my financial advisor. I used a prepaid burner phone I'd bought months ago, a relic of paranoia that now felt like prophecy. I instructed him to freeze all access to my accounts, to require dual-factor biometric authentication for any transaction, and to flag any inquiries originating from Marcus's known IP addresses. He asked if there was a problem. I told him I was simply updating my security protocols. By the end of that week, Eliza presented me with a thick, leather-bound portfolio. She said their lawyer had drafted a preliminary trust agreement just for me to review. Her tone was breezy, but her eyes were like chips of ice. I didn't open it. I set it on the table and asked about the grandchildren's soccer practice. She didn't press, but 2 days later, Marcus cornered me in the hallway. He said Eliza was only trying to protect me, that I was lucky to have such a devoted daughter. Then he leaned in, his voice a low growl. "Secrets are what destroy families, Clara. Transparency is a gift." I sidestepped him and locked myself in my room. That night, I methodically changed every password I had. I created a new encrypted email account. I scanned every one of my essential documents, my will, my birth certificate, the provenance papers for the 7 gold coins, and saved them to a micro SD card no bigger than my fingernail. I then carefully stitched it into the silk lining of an old jewelry box. I wasn't afraid yet, but I was preparing. This wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. and I was seeing the pattern with a terrible, crystalline clarity. The fourth week brought a suffocating quiet to the house. It was in the way Eliza stopped making eye contact, in the way Marcus's polished shoes seemed to echo louder on the hardwood floors, in the way the children were always whisked away to activities whenever I entered a room. The isolation was a physical presence. It began in earnest the morning I found my weekly pill organizer tampered with. The compartment for my Tuesday blood pressure medication was empty, yet I hadn't taken it. A new, unfamiliar white pill sat in the Wednesday slot. I didn't confront them. I flushed the entire week's supply and began taking pills only from a sealed bottle I kept hidden in my handbag. I stopped accepting any food or drink I hadn't prepared myself. One afternoon, I overheard Marcus on the phone in his study, the door left carelessly ajar. His voice was sharp, impatient. I heard phrases that froze my blood. Cognitive decline, undue influence, emergency guardianship. Later that day, Eliza approached me with a form. She claimed it was for their homeowner's insurance, a routine update. I read the fine print. It was a durable power of attorney agreement. My name was already typed in. She said it was a clerical error, her face a blank mask of innocence. I knew then that I had to leave. That night, under the cover of darkness, I retrieved the micro SD card. I also took a small, powerful listening device, another purchase from my period of paranoia, and secured it beneath the heavy desk in Marcus's study. Then I pulled out a manila envelope I kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard under my bed. Inside was the one secret they could never have uncovered. The deed to a small, secluded cabin in the Berkshires, owned by a shell corporation my husband had set up years ago. Arthur had always said every person needs a place to disappear. The next day, I feigned a dizzy spell. I told Eliza I needed to see my doctor in Boston for a checkup. She agreed instantly, her concern so flawlessly performed, it was breathtaking. Marcus offered to drive me. I politely declined, saying I preferred to take the train, to have the day to myself. He nodded, satisfied. They thought my spirit was finally breaking. They had no idea it was forging itself into steel. At the train station, I didn't go to the platform. I walked to the rental car counter, got into a nondescript sedan, and drove west, not east. I drove straight to the cabin Arthur had left for me. Before I was out of cell range, I made one call. It was to my lawyer, Miss Albright, a woman with a mind like a steel trap. I gave her the code word Arthur and I had established. The Eagles have landed. She knew exactly what it meant. She was to execute the plan we had put in place a year prior. Within minutes, every asset I owned was being transferred into an offshore, irrevocable trust, shielded by layers of legal firewalls. For the first time in a month, I breathed. The silence in the cabin was a living thing. It was made of pine scent and the rustle of unseen animals in the undergrowth. It didn't echo with lies. It hummed with truth. For 3 days, I did nothing but listen to that hum. I sat on the porch with a mug of tea, the micro SD card safe in my pocket, and unspooled the events of the past month. I thought about how insidiously they had worked, not with overt threats, but with the slow, dripping poison of manufactured concern. On the 4th morning, I used the cabin's satellite internet to check the new, secure email account. An alert from Ms. Albright was waiting. The listening device in Marcus's study had activated. She had attached a sound file. I put on my headphones and pressed play. I heard Marcus's voice, cold and clinical, speaking to an unknown party. He was discussing the sale of the 7 gold coins to a collector in Dubai, contingent on his imminent control of my estate. Then I heard Eliza's voice, thin and strained. "What if she fights it, Marcus? What if the doctors don't agree?" There was a pause, then Marcus's reply, devoid of any emotion. Then we move to the next phase. The palliative directive is already drafted. Dr. Evans is on board. It will be seen as a mercy. They hadn't just been trying to steal from me. They had a plan to sedate me into oblivion, a medical erasure signed off by a corrupt doctor. They were going to bury me while I was still breathing. I forwarded the file to the lead investigator at the state's Elder Protective Services Division, a man I had preemptively contacted weeks before. I gave him everything, a timeline of events, scans of the tampered documents, and the audio recording. I wasn't just building a defense, I was building their prosecution. That evening, I drove from the cabin to the home of my oldest friend, Genevieve. She opened the door, took one look at my face, and pulled me into her arms. No questions, no judgment, just a warm meal and a safe place to land. While I was there, the letter from their lawyer arrived, forwarded by Miss Albright. It was a sterile, threatening document, expressing grave concern over my abrupt and erratic disappearance. They were petitioning the court for an emergency conservatorship, claiming I was suffering from delusions and was being manipulated by outside parties. They cited my age, my recent widowhood, and my increasing confusion. Miss Albright's response was a work of art. It was polite, professional, and utterly devastating. She included my recent glowing cognitive evaluation, sworn affidavits from my neighbors and colleagues in Boston, and a full transcript of the audio recording from Marcus's study. She copied the district attorney, the state medical board, and the SEC. A few days later, a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit contacted me. It turned out the bank had already flagged Marcus for suspicious activity related to other clients. My case wasn't an anomaly. It was the key that unlocked a much larger pattern of predatory elder exploitation. I sat across from the detective and told him everything, not just the financial details, but the psychological warfare, the gaslighting, the isolation, the quiet chipping away at my reality. He took notes, his expression grim. He asked if I would be willing to testify. I said yes. The final action I took that week was for myself. With Mrs. Albright's help, I established a foundation. I funded it with the estimated value of the 7 gold coins. I named it the Arthur Selwyn Legacy Trust, after my husband. Its mission was simple: to provide pro bono legal services to elderly individuals targeted for financial exploitation and to fund educational programs on digital and financial literacy for seniors. I didn't need revenge. I needed to build something from the ruins. And with that act, the fire of my anger cooled into a resolve as hard and clear as a diamond. By the end of the month, Genevieve helped me find a beautiful condo in a quiet part of the city. I unpacked Arthur's books, hung our favorite paintings, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I stood at my own window, watching the world go by, and felt utterly, completely safe. I had lost a daughter, yes, but I had reclaimed something far more valuable: myself. 2 weeks after the court summarily dismissed their petition for conservatorship, calling it a frivolous and malicious abuse of the legal process, the first letter from Eliza arrived. It was handwritten on heavy cream stationery, her elegant script filling the page. It was a torrent of remorse and blame. She wrote of Marcus's influence, of the immense financial pressure they were under, of how she never wanted to hurt me. She said she missed me. She asked if we could talk. I read it once, then slipped it into a drawer, unanswered. The battle was over, but the war inside me was just beginning to quiet. I spent my days in a haze of stillness. I walked for hours along the Charles River, the familiar paths a balm to my fractured soul. I volunteered at the library again, the scent of old books and beeswax a comforting anchor to the person I used to be. Then, one rainy Tuesday, the federal prosecutor called. Marcus had been indicted, multiple counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and financial abuse of a vulnerable adult. The evidence, including the recording from his study and testimony from 2 of his other victims, was overwhelming. The prosecutor then told me something that made me sit down. Eliza had been offered a deal. In exchange for her full cooperation and testimony against her husband, she would face lesser charges, likely probation and community service. She had accepted. She had chosen to save herself. That night, I sat in the dark, the city lights painting soft patterns on my wall. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a profound, hollow ache. The daughter I had raised, the little girl who loved fairy tales and held my hand in thunderstorms, had made a calculated decision to trade her husband for her freedom. Love, loyalty, memory, they had all been items on a ledger, and she had settled her account. The trial was a blur of sterile courtrooms and clipped legal jargon. I testified, my voice even and clear. I looked at Eliza only once as she took the stand. She looked smaller, diminished, a ghost in a well-tailored suit. She recounted their schemes without emotion, her voice a monotone drone. She never looked at me. Marcus was found guilty on all counts. The sentence was 15 years in a federal prison. The day he was sentenced, another letter from Eliza arrived. This one was short. I know you can't forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that turning him in was the only honest thing I've done in 10 years. I'm sorry I destroyed us. This time, I didn't put the letter in a drawer. I took it, along with the first one, to the small fireplace in my living room. I struck a match and watched the paper curl into black ash. It wasn't an act of anger, but of release. I was letting go of the woman who wrote those letters and the mother who had longed to receive them. In the years that followed, the Arthur Selwyn Legacy Trust grew. We helped dozens of people reclaim their lives, their savings, their dignity. I found a new purpose, not as a victim, but as an advocate. I spoke at community centers and conferences, not just telling my story, but sharing the strategies of survival. One day, a young law student approached me after a talk. She said her grandmother was one of the first people the trust had helped. She said I had saved her family. She wanted to volunteer, and in her bright, determined eyes, I saw the future. I saw the legacy. I never saw Eliza again. I heard through Genevieve that she moved out west, took back her maiden name, and found a quiet job in a bookstore. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I wonder if she ever thinks of me. I hope she found some measure of peace. But my peace is no longer tied to her. My peace is my own. It is in the garden I now tend on my balcony, in the laughter I share with Genevieve, in the quiet satisfaction of the work I do. It is the peace that comes not from forgetting the past, but from building a future it can no longer touch. Betrayal doesn't always come from an enemy. Sometimes it wears the face of the person you love most. It tries to steal your future by rewriting your past. But your story is yours alone to write. The final chapter belongs to you. It is never too late to pick up the pen and declare that your legacy will not be one of silence, but of strength.